Add critical language proficiency to your resume with language training at MEI. Through group classes or one-on-one instruction in Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, Turkish, and more will help you achieve fluency so that you and your resume stand apart from the crowd. Visit mei.edu/education for a list of classes and tutoring options, or call us at 202-770-0344. From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast featuring discussion and analysis on U.S. foreign policy and contemporary political and social issues in the Middle East, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Fadi Nassar, U.S. Lebanon Fellow at the Middle East Institute and Director of the Institute for Social Justice and Conflict Resolution, and Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the Lebanese American University. Today's episode focuses on French diplomacy in Lebanon, particularly in light of the appointment of veteran French diplomat Jean-Yves Le Drian as the French President's Special Envoy to Lebanon. It's a pleasure to have with us today Professor Karim Bitar. His expertise in French and Lebanese politics and decision-making offers much-needed insight and nuance to the complexities of French foreign policy in Lebanon and the uncertain road ahead in the crisis-hit country. Professor Bitar is an associate professor of international relations and former director of the Institute of Political Science at Lebanon's Université Saint-Joseph. He is also an associate fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy and a research associate at Brussels Institut Média. He is also a professor of international relations and of history of political thought at several French Grandes Écoles. Thank you for being with us today, Karim.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you for having me.
As an opening question, I thought we could start off with a brief background on Special Envoy Le Drian. Can you tell us a bit about the thought behind his selection and this post?
Okay, so Jean-Yves Le Drian, as you said, is a veteran French politician. He started in the 1980s. He was close to the French Socialist Party under President François Mitterrand. And in the past 10 years, he has become central to French politics. He occupied very sensitive positions. He was the defense minister and then the foreign affairs minister. In these two positions, he became extremely close to several countries in the Arab world and North Africa, particularly Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, but also Egypt. He is known in France as a man who has a lot of clout, a lot of back channels. He is not only a diplomat, but he is also capable of promoting the interests of the French defense industry in various Arab countries. He is a good listener. He listens to his interlocutors. He also came under attack in the past few years by those who initially supported the Arab protest movement that started in 2011, because France and Le Drian in particular were perceived as having basically embraced or condoned the full-fledged counter-revolutions that have triumphed in most Arab countries, particularly in Egypt after the 2013 military takeover. So Jean-Yves Le Drian was appointed a special envoy to Lebanon at a very difficult time because France's traditional allies in Lebanon were shocked when they found out that France was supporting or even promoting Sleiman Frangieh as a potential Lebanese president, considering that Frangieh is not only a very close ally of Hezbollah, but also a very intimate childhood friend of Bashar al-Assad. So France came under harsh criticism. Many people in the French Lebanese community, and there are over 200 or 250,000 Lebanese based in France, And in Lebanon, most Christian parties and most friends of France were surprised, to say the least. So many people think that Le Drian's appointment could be perhaps to send a signal to the Lebanese that they have been heard, to tell them that France is not fully committed, that it has submitted this as a possibility, but that Frangieh is not France's candidate in Lebanon, that France is open to listening to other alternatives, to studying the emergence of alternative candidates, of a plan B, and that France remains committed to preserving Lebanon's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity. So far, it is an exploratory visit that he has conducted to Lebanon. He is not carrying a new French initiative. He came to listen to Lebanese political leaders of all stripes, and also to civil society, to representatives of the protest movements. So the main objective is to send a message to the entire Lebanese political spectrum that we are trying to help preventing a state collapse in Lebanon. We have suggested this scenario in which a pro Hezbollah president would be elected and a prime minister who would have reformist credentials and who would be closer to Saudi Arabia would also be part of this new governing team. If you think that there is a more appropriate solution, we as France are ready to discuss it. So I think it's partly a public relations visit and partly a genuine attempt at finding an alternative, considering that the Sleiman Frangieh candidacy seems to be facing major stumbling blocks.
Very insightful, and it really helps situate Le Drian's visit in Lebanon. There are two questions I have in mind. The first, if we could take things a bit back. Since the crisis, the Elysee has primarily led the international file on Lebanon. And President Macron appears to have also personalized that leadership, particularly in the aftermath of the Port of Beirut blast. What, if any, is France's vision for a way out of Lebanon's crisis? And where does Lebanon fit in President Macron and France's greater foreign policy strategy?
Okay, interesting. That's a pretty wide question. And indeed, I think it is important to go back in time. President Macron gave his first foreign policy speech when he was still a candidate in 2017 in Beirut. He was visiting Beirut during the campaign, and he gave a speech at the École Supérieure des Affaires, a French business school that was inaugurated by his predecessor, Jacques Chirac. And he basically said that France would come back to playing the role of an honest broker in the Middle East. He criticized his predecessors, Francois Hollande and Nicolas Sarkozy, as having been perhaps too aligned on the United States. He criticized the various Western interventionism in the Middle East, and he said that he would go back to the foreign policies that were led by Charles de Gaulle and François Mitterrand, meaning obviously an ally of the United States, but an ally who can be critical of the United States when necessary. So Macron came to know Lebanon rather well. Several of his friends are Lebanese. He followed the financial crisis very closely. Macron, before entering politics, had worked as a banker in Paris. So when some of his Lebanese friends who work in the banking sector started telling him about what was happening in Lebanon with the central bank, the shady financial engineering, etc., he immediately understood what was going on. And he was one of the first, actually the first foreign leader who spoke of the Ponzi scheme. And at the time, many Lebanese bankers and politicians were upset because he denounced this Ponzi scheme. But today, the World Bank has published an exhaustive report, also called Ponzi Economics, denouncing what had been happening on this front. So Macron is determined to simultaneously tried to prevent state collapse in Lebanon, to give priority to rebuilding state institutions, to bank restructuring. And he thinks that France can play an important role because France is one of the few actors that speaks to all Lebanese factions. Even though relations between France and Iran have been very tense in the past few years, and actually ever since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, France has never completely cut its channels with Iranian backed Hezbollah. So even when he visited Beirut shortly after the August 4 blast in 2020, he met with a Hezbollah representative, and this was criticized by certain political parties in Lebanon. But France, and particularly Macron, we could establish a parallel with Barack Obama's way of handling foreign policy. Macron views himself as a pragmatist. He would like to push an idealistic human rights agenda, but deep down, he is always ready to go back to the fundamentals of realpolitik. So he considers that Hezbollah is a major actor in Lebanon, that completely cutting relations with Hezbollah would be counterproductive, and that it would be better to engage Hezbollah and try to use France's position to be a mediator. Under Macron and also under his predecessors, Hollande and Sarkozy, France became particularly close to Gulf countries. Under Sarkozy, it was Qatar. Under François Hollande, it was Saudi Arabia. Macron has a very strong relationship with the United Arab Emirates. And he would like to use these relationships with the Gulf in order to try to push a compromise in Lebanon. But they think that this compromise has to include Hezbollah and has to take into consideration the interests of the Iranian Syrian axis. So France always tells the Lebanese that we can help you precisely because we talk to all Lebanese. Unlike the United States and unlike the United Kingdom, France has not put Hezbollah on the terror list. French diplomats regularly meet with Hezbollah's representatives. It does not mean that they are aligned or that they are in cahoots. On the contrary, the relations are very tense. Several French academics were taken hostage in Iran. There are lots of historical grievances. When Hezbollah emerged in the 1980s, there was a massive terror attack against the French military force that was based in Lebanon, the Drakkar. Several French journalists were taken hostage. So relationships were always extremely tense. However, France, because of this historical stance of basically trying to distance itself from the United States, trying to engage the other side, maintains these relationships. So theoretically, France would have been very well placed to help Lebanon put an end to this presidential vacuum if it had been able to use its leverage, its relationship with the Gulf, with the United States, and its channels of communication with Hezbollah. However, many people still fail to understand why did France accept to make so many concessions to Hezbollah without getting much in return. It is true that under the initial agreement that was proposed, Hezbollah and its allies had accepted that the prime minister would be a figure like Nawaf Salam, a respected senior diplomat who had reformist credentials, who is close to Saudi Arabia, who is a man of integrity. However, those who know Lebanese institutions told the French from the very beginning that the president is elected for a 6-year term, while the prime minister can be ousted at any moment, and that Hezbollah could have been taking you for a ride, promising you that the president would not obstruct the reform agenda of the prime minister, but that no guarantees at all were given. So it remains unclear why did Macron and why did France endorse this scenario. Some diplomats close to Emmanuel Macron say that it's mostly because of the lack of alternatives. They tell you Slimane Frangieh is by no means France's candidate. He is Hezbollah's candidate. But France recognizes that Hezbollah, whether we like it or not, is one of the most important players in Lebanon, arguably the largest political party. We witnessed between 2014 and 2016 that they blocked the election of a president for over 29 months until they were able to get their ally Michel Aoun elected. So France, afraid that Hezbollah would use similar tactics, had tried basically to take into considerations Hezbollah's condition of having a president that they fully trust, but they said we are going to widen the parameters of the negotiation, meaning you want Slimane Frangieh, okay, but let us negotiate who is going to be the prime minister, who is going to be the governor of the central bank, what guarantees are you willing to give, and this was a way basically of preventing a long vacuum and a state collapse. France is very worried because it's witnessing the progressive downfall, demise of every functioning institution in Lebanon. And considering France is perhaps the only country that is still heavily involved in Lebanon on the economic, cultural level through support to the Lebanese army, etc., they consider that a prolonged vacuum at this stage after the economic crisis would be particularly disastrous, that the situation is completely different from 2014, and therefore a solution that is not ideal, but that would prevent a complete disintegration of Lebanon would be preferable to a long-term vacuum.
Thank you. Thank you, Karim. I think you really put it quite clearly. President Macron's sort of vision and helped situate it within France's wider foreign policy relationships and objectives. Early on, you told us that Le Drian signals a potential walking away, especially in light of intense local rejection of the Frangieh sort of initiative. I thought perhaps I could probe here and benefit from your insight. Are there competing visions to that of Macron's of the role France should play in Lebanon? That perhaps it should not play the role of a mediator, but rather one similar to, as it did with 1559, be a guarantor of democracy.
Yes, absolutely. There are various trends in French foreign policy circles. To simplify, some call one of these tendencies an Atlanticist tendency, meaning those who are closer to NATO and the United States. And the second line, also to simplify, is called the tradition Gaulo-Mitterrandienne, meaning the tradition of Charles de Gaulle and François Mitterrand of trying to be closer to the third world, closer to being a bridge between the United States and its enemies. So there are a few members of the French parliament, a few senators who have criticized Macron's approach, who have said this is not even realpolitik, this is beyond cynicism. France is accepting the fait accompli, the status quo is accepting Hezbollah's dominance of the Lebanese political spectrum, is giving Hezbollah many guarantees. And on the Lebanese side, many went even further and said that France was motivated mostly by mercantile interests, by financial and economic potential rewards related not only to Lebanon, but also to Syria and Iran. Major French corporations are present in the Middle East, whether in the oil and gas sector like Total Energy, or in the maritime transport like CMA CGM, which is a family business owned by Lebanese-born businessman Rodolphe Saadeh, which has significant interests in Lebanon and in Syria. However, I am not absolutely sure that these financial and economic interests outweigh the political considerations that I presented. Definitely, like any country, France tries to protect its economic interests and to promote the interests of its own corporations. However, I think it's mostly perhaps a naive vision of realpolitik, an attempt to find a compromise. And it's pretty much in line with the misguided policies that France and most other Western countries have adopted towards the Middle East and North Africa in the past 10 years. After 2011, we felt that they understood the lessons. They understood that short term stability should not be encouraged at all costs because it plants the seeds of long term instability. France had supported Ben Ali in Tunisia until the very last minute. It had supported Mubarak in Egypt. So in between 2011 and 2013, there was some soul searching in France, attempts to promote a human rights agenda, a democratization agenda in the Middle East. But ever since 2013, and in every single Arab country, France, and the same I think could be said about the UK and the United States, have ended up accepting this idea that authoritarianism is back in the Arab world. So we are back. We are witnessing a return of all the Orientalist tropes that the Arab world and North Africa need strong men, that there is only an alternative between radical Islamists and military, ruthless strong men, and that the liberals, the Democrats, the progressives are only marginal forces in this part of the world. And I think this is very unfortunate. And it's particularly unfortunate that this vision is still dominant at a time when we have the Democrats in office in the United States and the center right in power in France, because these two parties, France and the United States, had they coordinated their positions a little bit better, would have been able to really promote a more ambitious agenda for the Middle East than simply endorsing the return of autocracy and repression and securitocracy.
Karim, that's very insightful. Both, as you hinted to, both Biden and Macron pledged to prioritize democracy promotion to some extent in their foreign policy, not just as some sort of tertiary issue, but that it was a fundamental key security issue, especially now that we see in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. To that, I wanted to ask, is there a shift? Is there an opening, a rethinking, at least in French foreign policy, that democracy promotion is worth the fight? That false stability should not be, as you put, a fait accompli that is accepted? At least on Lebanon, are you observing any openings where France is willing to prioritize democracy promotion in Lebanon, particularly in response to political violence?
I'm afraid not, and this actually pains me. You know, your question reminded me of the famous quote by Mario Cuomo, the former governor of New York, who said that in politics, one campaigns in poetry, but once elected, you have to govern in prose. You campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. And this applies to both Biden and Macron. During their presidential campaigns, both of them spoke of democracy promotion, of opposing authoritarianism, of protecting civil society, human rights activists, etc. And shortly after their elections, they realized that they had to deal with the realities, that they had to make some deals with unsavory governments. So I'm afraid that the situation in France is even more problematic today than in the United States, because at least in the United States, you have some voices outside the establishment who are still very vocal about democracy promotion, about human rights, about putting an end to double standards. In France, I think that both the political establishment and public opinion at large no longer have any hopes or no longer support the democratization of the Middle East, because on both sides of the political spectrum and for different reasons, they ended up believing that democracy is simply not suited to this part of the world. Now, this goes back to very old colonial cliches, but this colonial mindset is still present. So, in the United States, there is still some hope because there is public opinion pressure from certain sectors. In France, within the political establishment, you do have some reasonable voices who understand that the current policies of supporting every single strongman, even Kais Said in Tunisia after the recent crackdown, is still handled with care by the French Foreign Affairs Ministry that has not been critical enough. So there are a few diplomats, particularly among the so-called Arabists, those who know the region quite well, who are pushing for support of Arab civil societies and progressives and liberals, but I'm afraid they are in the minority. And unfortunately, this is not something specific to France, but it is perhaps more anchored in France because the traumas of the Algerian war are still present. You know, as William Faulkner said, the past is never dead, it's not even past. So the Algerian war ended 60 years ago, and sometimes we have the feeling that it is still ongoing. So large segments of the French public opinion still believes in the cliches that were peddled by the generals who waged this war in Algeria, that the Arabs understand only force and that they need to be ruled by heavy-handed authoritarian strongmen. And this is very unfortunate, and it will require a lot of efforts on the part of Arab intellectuals, of Arab civil societies, to change this mindset that is still dominant in Europe and in the United States.
To that point, Karim, you mentioned Le Drian came on listening mode. Could you give us some insight on perhaps what he may have heard by some of the leading change and reform actors in the country who may, as you have put it, been surprised by France's earlier backing of a false consensus?
Okay, so Le Drian came to Lebanon and visited all the traditional establishment politicians on all sides, the Maronite patriarchs, the commander-in-chief of the Lebanese army, representatives of all political parties with no exception. But the French embassy in Lebanon made sure to also organize a lunch and a dinner with small groups of civil society figures, intellectuals, opposition opinion leaders, in order to make sure that he hears the voice of the Lebanese protest movement that emerged in October 2019. So, what I can tell you is what I heard on the very first day that Le Drian arrived. So, the French embassy had invited 5 or 6 Lebanese writers, intellectuals, opinion leaders, political activists. So I was part of this small group, and I realized that most of them were very vocal, telling him openly that they felt the French initiative was misguided, that Slimane Frangieh did not represent the aspirations of the Lebanese youth, that after this massive, unprecedented protest movement that happened in 2019, that basically affected every single Lebanese city from north to south. For the very first time in Lebanese history, people took to the streets in Nabateeh, in Tripoli, in Beirut. Shiites, Sunnis, Christians, they demonstrated not as members of their sect, but as Lebanese citizens. It was a protest for dignity, for social and economic rights. It was not based on sectarian grievances. So those opinion leaders close to the October 17 movement, clearly told Le Drian that it would be a slap in the face of those 1.5 or 2 million Lebanese that demonstrated in 2019 if France would accept the return of the Lebanese Ancien Régime or of the traditional political establishment that Frangieh represents. So while it is definitely true that Slimane Frangieh is someone who is on the personal level a frank and sincere personality who does not stab anyone in the back, you know what you're going to get. He's not going to promise a change and reform. He presents himself as a traditional sectarian feudal lord. Even though his honesty might be considered refreshing when you compare it with the duplicity of many other Lebanese politicians, that nonetheless, he does not represent the aspirations of the Lebanese youth who are emigrating in droves and who would have liked both a president and a prime minister who would both be committed to state building, to reform, to economic, to building a new Lebanese social contract. So I think Le Drian heard the message loud and clear. And while he did not openly say that France was turning the page of the Frangieh candidacy, it was obvious that he was starting to listen to these criticisms and that France was starting to examine the possibility of a plan B. This does not mean that they will not go back to the initial plan if towards the end of the year they realize that no third man has emerged and has gained acceptance by both Hezbollah and its adversaries. But what was different was that Le Drian was really willing to listen to various points of views. Because when Macron came to Lebanon 48 hours after the blast, we also had a meeting. We were about 10 civil society figures with him, and Macron was mostly lecturing the Lebanese opposition, telling it you are too fragmented, you are too divided, you have to put your house in order if you want to hope to basically defeat the traditional establishment. Le Drian did not lecture the persons that he met. He listened to their concerns. This does not mean that these concerns will be taken into consideration. Ultimately, the experience of the past 20 years has shown that realpolitik always or almost always triumphs in this part of the world. But at least I think that the point of view of those who still dream of radical political change in Lebanon has been heard.
Thank you, Karim, particularly for helping us, appreciate some of the differences in styles and approaches of Le Drian and Macron, particularly with their engagement of local stakeholders. But that helps me perhaps sort of lead into this question of Macron personalized much of his leadership. He committed and promised, especially after the Port of Beirut blast, to prioritize accountability, reform, and democratization in Lebanon. And it's not just that his promises didn't materialize, but as you had pointed out, the backing of a candidate like Frangieh really alienated significant stakeholders, whether in the opposition, change, reform, or wider public. With that, I have to ask, how has that sort of affected Macron's personal credibility and France's sort of reputation in Lebanon?
Well, I would say that Macron's credibility has certainly taken a hit because there were extremely high expectations after his visits that followed the Beirut blast. And these high expectations were followed by very low returns. So France's reputation has definitely been affected and tarnished, but I do not think that this is irreversible because throughout history, every single foreign country that has tried to interfere in Lebanese affairs has seen its credibility eroded or affected or destroyed. It's the case for the United States, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt in the 50s and 60s. Lebanon could be described as a graveyard for idealistic foreign policies and for local reform minded activists. Very often they end up being disillusioned. It is true that Macron has turned Lebanon into a personal concern for him. Initially, the Lebanese appreciated that, but ultimately it proved to be problematic. And this is not specific to Macron. It's very often the case in France that foreign policy is considered the chasse gardée, the private domain of the French president. Every French president wants to take his own stance, and very often you have parallel diplomacies. You have the French Quai d'Orsay, the Foreign Affairs Ministry, and you have the personal advisors of the president who often end up basically taking the lead. In the past 10 years, it is the cellule diplomatique, a diplomatic cell, a few senior diplomats who have direct access to the president, who have set the tone of French foreign policy towards the Middle East and North Africa. And very often this has created resentment at the French Foreign Affairs Ministry, where senior diplomats, particularly those who know the region quite well, who speak the languages, feel that they have been basically sidelined. So today, France's reputation has indeed been affected, particularly France's traditional allies in the Christian community were disappointed. But I think most Lebanese also realize that France is trying its best, that no one has a magic wand to solve the Lebanese problems. They realize that Macron has been taken for a ride by the local Lebanese sectarian leaders and feudal lords. They all officially pledged when he was around on August 6, 2020, that they would change their antics, that they would accept the formation within less than 2 weeks of a reform-minded government. And as soon as he was on the plane returning to Paris, they had already started to torpedo his French initiative. So he might have been naive, but the Lebanese appreciated the fact that he was the only foreign leader who decided to immediately come to Lebanon and to at least try to get the local leaders to change their behavior. But this is something extremely difficult at a time where you have intense polarization, where you still have regional proxy wars that are being waged by Iran and Saudi Arabia and other countries. Now, the paradox is that today we have a détente, we have a de-escalation between following the Iranian-Saudi Chinese broker deal. So France could have put to use this Saudi-Iranian rapprochement to help offer a more realistic solution to the Lebanese problem. And this might not be too late because the deal is only a few weeks old. For Saudi Arabia, the priority is definitely not Lebanon. The priority is most likely Yemen. Once the Saudis obtained the security guarantees that they had demanded and that Beijing had promised to make sure that Iran would keep its part of the bargain, it is possible that Saudi Arabia would start again to engage Lebanon after several years of basically trying to run away from the Lebanese migraines because they felt that they had invested lots of time and energy and money on Lebanon, and they ended up seeing Hezbollah's increasing control of the country. But considering there is such a strong economic relationship and strategic partnership between France and Saudi Arabia, it is possible that in a few months, this French-Saudi initiative could end up helping the Lebanese reach a compromise. And ideally, the French and the United States would also be in a good position to convince Saudi Arabia to support Lebanon economically, because even if a new president is elected and manages to reach a deal with the International Monetary Fund, the money that Lebanon is going to get from the IMF is definitely not enough. Lebanon needs a massive influx of foreign capital, and this can only come from the Gulf.
You drew attention early on that one of the key drivers of French, as you put it, realpolitik and strategic thinking in Lebanon was driven out of a worry, even if short sighted, that Hezbollah's obstruction would lead to immediate state failure. Does France have any tools at its disposal to respond to that obstruction? And in this sense, to avoid a fait accompli and pressure Hezbollah to compromise? Arguably, as you put it, early on we saw concessions, right? Some have gone further to call it appeasement. So, my question to you is, does France, even if not on its own, whether with the United States, with its regional partners, as you mentioned, Saudi Arabia, have an ability to pressure Hezbollah to compromise?
They still have some leverage that they have not used. It is difficult to put pressure on Hezbollah itself because Hezbollah is not part of the formal economy. They have their parallel channels. So it's difficult to sanction Hezbollah directly. Cutting the communication channels would be counterproductive. At least the French think that it would not help Lebanon if they cut all links to Hezbollah. Now, when Macron initially visited Lebanon in 2020 after the blast, he was reluctant to accept the idea of sanctions. And I remember that several Lebanese opposition figures insisted that France and Europe should use the threat of sanctions that the Lebanese political establishment only understands when you follow the money, when you hit their pocketbook. It's only a year later that Macron accepted this idea of sanctions. Initially, he wanted to engage them. He wanted to get behavior modification. So he used carrots more than he used the sticks. A year later, he started accepting the idea of imposing sanctions. But in order for these sanctions to be effective, they have to be European sanctions, not exclusively French. And it is quite a complicated legal process. You need European unanimity. And Hungary, under Viktor Orban, clearly said that it was reluctant to sanction Hezbollah's allies, the Free Patriotic Movement, because, as you know, Orban is a member of this international nationalist authoritarian identitarian axis. And they came to believe that sanctioning the Free Patriotic Movement would weaken Eastern Christians for some reason. So they are pretty much the Hungarians in line with Bashar al-Assad and in line with Gibran Bassil. So the French today, I think, understood that sanctions can be effective at least as a threat, as a sword of Damocles that would be hovering above the heads of the local Lebanese actors. Now, what is very important when it comes to sanction is to also coordinate the efforts with the United States, because one of the reasons the initial French initiative failed in 2020, they were about to form a reformist government. The Lebanese ambassador to Germany was put in charge of forming it, Mustafa Adib. And shortly before this government was formed, the United States, at the time it was the Trump administration, decided to place sanctions on two persons belonging to the same side of the political spectrum, Ali Hassan Khalil, who is close to Nabih Berri, a former finance minister, and another former minister who is close to Sulaiman Frangieh and close to Hezbollah. So this led the Speaker of the Lebanese Parliament, Nabih Berri, to adopt a more radical, more intransigent position, and this reformist government did not see the light. So there was clearly a US attempt to torpedo the French initiative or a miscommunication between the French and the Americans. Now, ever since Biden was elected, the communication between France and the US has considerably improved. When the United States used sanctions afterwards, it was pretty well calibrated because they sanctioned one business person who was close to the Free Patriotic Movement and another business person who was closer to the Hariri political faction. And those were the two main actors who had brokered the so-called presidential consensus that led to the election of Michel Aoun. So the sanctions issued by the US were quite revealing because we saw that before reaching a political agreement in 2016, the Lebanese factions had initially brokered a business deal between themselves. And it's only once every side had obtained part of the pie that they agreed to elect a president that was Michel Aoun. So today, if the United States and France try to put pressure on the entire political establishment to make sure that they do not give the impression that they are targeting exclusively one side, it can be, in my opinion, effective. I think sanctions is something, a language that the Lebanese leaders understand. They love to spend their vacations on the French Riviera. They do not, particularly Christian leaders, they do not want to be blacklisted by the West. This harms their presidential ambitions. So I think it is important to use the threat of sanctions. I even testified before the European Parliament saying sanctions should be considered. However, these sanctions should not target exclusively Hezbollah and its allies, because if there's something that all Lebanese can agree upon is that corruption is very widespread in Lebanon and that both sides of the political spectrum are deeply enmeshed with this political financial oligarchy that is running the country. So if we use the threat of sanction against political actors from both sides and make sure that they respect the Constitution, they should all be, according to Articles 74 and 75 of the Constitution. The Parliament today has become an electoral college. They have to go to Parliament and vote for whoever they want to vote, but they cannot keep obstructing the election. So if the international community, France, Europe, the United States, and perhaps certain Gulf countries, and this is something, by the way, that they agreed upon when 5 countries met in Paris a couple of months ago, France, the United States, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, they all agreed that they would collectively place sanctions on whoever obstructs the election of a Lebanese president. So far, they did not yet agree on the mechanism of these sanctions, but I think the idea itself should not be dismissed because this is one of the few possibilities to have leverage and to place the local leaders in front of their responsibilities.
Thank you, and I'm grateful for your time. And I just have a few more questions. I thought perhaps we could get into the central bank governor. France has, and different components within French policy making have sort of put a spotlight on Lebanon's central bank governor. Do you mind explaining and unpacking to us why that matters and the sort of road ahead, given that the central bank governor's tenure ends quite soon?
The itinerary of the central bank governor, Riyad Salameh, reads like a novel. He is really the chief financial officer of the entire Lebanese mafia. He is someone who has long enjoyed excellent relations with the United States, with France, with the international community. For a while, France was even thinking of supporting him as a potential president. Until 2017, he was very close to the West. And at the same time, he was able to maintain solid working relationship with most Lebanese political parties. And even when the United States placed sanctions on Hezbollah, Riyad Salameh abided, of course, with the US sanctions, but he also helped Hezbollah circumvent the US sanctions. So he offered considerable services to most foreign countries and also to most local players, including Hezbollah. So, what is interesting today is that Riyad Salameh, in his line of defense, is trying to portray himself as having been scapegoated because he is opposed to a political camp of which Hezbollah is part of. But the cold hard truth is that he would not have been able to remain for 30 years as governor of the central bank if he had not been supported also by Hezbollah. And when they renewed his term for the fifth time in 2017, every single Lebanese party supported him. So he helped Hezbollah circumvent the US sanctions. He turned a blind eye to Hezbollah opening parallel financial establishments known as Qard al Hassan. He even gave a license to an economist close to Hezbollah to be a conveyor of funds. So Salameh was always hedging his bets, maintaining a close working relationship with the United States, helping the US in the fight against money laundering, etc. But he is also protected by Nabih Berri, the Speaker of Parliament, who is Hezbollah's major ally. He is protected by Najib Miati. So he cannot pretend to be a victim of a political vendetta. Today, it has become clear to everybody that he is accused of extremely serious financial crimes. Six different countries have investigated him. He is accused of embezzlement, falsification of documents, money laundering. So these are extremely serious charges, and he should have been dismissed a long time ago. Now, his term ends pretty soon. And this is arguably perhaps more important than the election of the Lebanese president, because in the Lebanese laws, the governor of the central bank actually has unparalleled powers. He is someone who can single handedly decide on life or death matters, not only monetary policy, but also subsidies. He can decide to fund or not to fund access to medication, to fuel, etc. So, according to the Lebanese tradition, the governor of the central bank has to be very close to the United States, but he also should be able to maintain channels of communication with all Lebanese political parties. And it will be extremely difficult to find someone who can juggle all this and at the same time be a reform minded professional determined to clean up the mess at the central bank and to finally put in place sound economic policies that would allow Lebanon to break this vicious circle. In the past 30 years, Lebanon, like several other Arab countries, had become a rentier economy. It has completely neglected several sectors, not only agriculture and industry, but also the knowledge economy, high tech, etc. This is to a large extent because the logic that was adopted by Riyad Salameh and many others was a purely financial logic based on speculation, focused on a few sectors like tourism, services, the banking sector, speculation. And it completely neglected all the productive sectors of the Lebanese economy. And it also failed to exercise proper oversight, and an entire population has been robbed of its savings because of these policies. So the West has an enormous part of responsibility because they have covered Riyad Salame for too long. Today, France has abandoned him. The United States is no longer protecting him, but we still do not have an international and local consensus on who his successor will be.
It's striking to me, given that we're talking about a matter of weeks before that term ends. How will the presidential paralysis affect that outcome of who will take his place, let alone the accountability for, the crimes you've mentioned?
It is indeed quite a quandary because it is difficult to appoint a new central bank governor when we do not have a president. The governor is supposed to take an oath before the president when he is appointed. Technically, there are some precedents in European countries, in Belgium, in France, in the 1950s, when you have a caretaking government. This caretaking government can also handle urgent matters, and this is definitely an urgent matter. So theoretically, one could argue that this government can appoint a new central bank governor, but there are political obstacles because both France and the United States and local actors are thinking in terms of a package deal. Not only who will be the next president, but there are three major positions: the prime minister and the central bank governor and the president. So if you want to appoint a central bank governor that would be associated with one side of the political spectrum, you have to make sure that the other top jobs are occupied by politicians who are closer to the other side. And you also have other senior positions that are supposed to be filled in the upcoming months. The term of the army chief ends on January 15, 2024. This will also be a turning point. So this, I think, was one of the major reasons that led France to push for this misguided Frangieh Nawaf Salam ticket, because they felt that otherwise it would be extremely difficult to fill these senior positions. And if you do not fill these positions during a massive economic and financial crisis, there is a significant risk of witnessing state collapse and fragmentation. Many Lebanese today no longer believe in the idea of Lebanon. They no longer believe in coexistence. Many people have become so obsessed with identity politics, and Hezbollah's hubris and arrogance have become so egregious that many other actors are starting to contemplate the idea, rather than confronting Hezbollah's vision, of mimicking Hezbollah's vision. So rather than establishing a strong state that would make sure it controls the entire territory, many radicals are today contemplating the division of Lebanon into sectarian mini states. And this would be a recipe for endless internal strife, because the history of Lebanon shows very clearly that most confrontations were not intercommunal, but rather intracommunal. It is within every community that you find various political alignments. Many people are obsessed with pluralism and they think exclusively of sectarian pluralism. We have to find a way, I think, to manage political pluralism in Lebanon. Every community has deep fault lines within the community. Throughout their history, Lebanese Christians were never united. They were always divided. Some were looking towards the West, some were looking toward the Arab East. The same goes in the Sunni community and even in the Shiite community. It would be an enormous mistake to think of Lebanese communal tensions as being inherent, and to think that Lebanese sects are homogeneous groups and that they all share an identity because they belong to the same sect. The Lebanese are divided between liberals and conservatives, between those who are secular and those who are more religious. They are divided on foreign policy, on defense policy, on financial and economic issues. The divide is not sectarian. Unfortunately, because of Hezbollah's behavior in the past few years, it is taking an ugly sectarian turn, and we are seeing an increasing number of Lebanese Christians and Lebanese Sunnis wanting to explore new formulas of parting ways with Hezbollah. And I'm afraid none of these proposals are really viable options. Lebanon, whether it will be easy or not, has to remain a unitary state. This unitary state can definitely and should be decentralized, but thinking in terms of homogeneous sectarian cantons, in my mind, would be disastrous, particularly for the Christian community that has always prided itself on its opening towards the East and the West, and that has always tried to maintain a degree of pluralism, of liberalism, to believe in democratic citizenship. So it's really tragic to see that some Christian political parties, rather than offering a new ambitious vision, are mimicking the Amal Hezbollah duo and trying to create a Christian duopoly in order to protect Christian interests. The only way to protect religious minorities in Lebanon is to appease the existential angst of these minorities, and it is only by strengthening state, strengthening the institutions, and transcending the constant sectarian power struggle. And the constitution that we have, with all its flaws, offer significant tools that can help us go a long way towards this new Lebanon. If we implement the constitution as a package deal with the creation of a Senate, with administrative decentralization, with the abolition of sectarianism in the lower house, and with significant administrative reform, it would be a first step towards the consolidation of Lebanon as a united liberal democratic state, and it could pave the way for a new social contract. Lebanon is indivisible. This was the message that Ghassan Touaini, the late great intellectual, spent his lifetime arguing. We cannot divide Lebanon along sectarian lines. It would be anathema to many liberal Democrats in Lebanon. It would defeat the entire Lebanese idea. And here, I think there are reasons to be hopeful, because many Lebanese, even though they are today afraid and disillusioned, do not want to accept this idea of sectarian cantons. And most importantly, the international community is unanimous in rejecting these proposals, whether France or the Vatican or the United States or Saudi Arabia. They all think that Lebanon's unity should be preserved. In 1976 and 1977, Lebanese unity was also jeopardized, and it is thanks to the Vatican, the Maronite Church, and France that Lebanon was able to maintain its unity, and it took a couple of decades to regain its sovereignty. Today, we have to lead the fight on several fronts simultaneously, preserving Lebanese national unity, making sure Lebanon regains its sovereignty, and building a new social contract that would finally bring some social justice to this country that is deeply unequal. And this economic crisis is deepening the sectarian animosities.
Thank you, Karim. And before letting you go, I thought I'd build up on what you've just shared, particularly this notion of the idea of Lebanon, with a question particular to our audience, many of whom are in Washington, perhaps today, given the episode in Paris. Is there a sort of question, certainly efforts to recapture the state, to reform the country's political economy, to fight for the idea of Lebanon, as you put it, must be locally led. And there is such a base. There's a strong organic push for that. Arguably, it was this push that defeated the French led initiative for Frangie. Is there a question, though, to be asked of what international responsibility looks like to those local led efforts, particularly in the face of that sort of authoritarian violence that is emerging in Lebanon and the region?
Yes, indeed, you put it very well. The only road to success would be to bridge this gap, to use the Lebanese diaspora and to use international pressure in order to empower the reformers in Lebanon. Change cannot come from abroad. Change has to come from local actors. However, these local actors have been completely disempowered in the past 20 years. We have had massive interference from Iran that has supported Hezbollah, which is the jewel of the crown for the Iranian revolution. And we have also had a massive financial injection. Saudi Arabia has been funding Lebanese actors. So the only way to allow Lebanese liberals, Democrats, progressives, independent, reform minded actors to become able to defeat this mafia that is running the country, this financial oligarchy that is supported, as you said, by an authoritarian state of mind and even to a certain extent a totalitarian hegemony, the only way would be to combine local initiatives with international pressure and to increase the support that the Lebanese diaspora is offering. The Lebanese diaspora is not a panacea. It does not have a magic wand. It cannot maintain the country afloat. Even though we have remittances today that are extremely high, perhaps $7 or $8 billion a year, which is enormous because even Egypt, which has over 105 million inhabitants, gets pretty much the same amount of remittances. Lebanon cannot rely exclusively on the financial support of the diaspora. Lebanon is in dire need of structural reform, administrative and economic reforms. And in order to defeat the various nefarious actors present on the Lebanese territory, you need to combine a strong trans communitarian political movements in Lebanon, an alliance of all reform minded groups with pressure from the international community. Unfortunately, as we said at the beginning of this podcast, I'm afraid that the international community, the West, has become completely oblivious, completely unwilling to see that behind this Eastern mystery, as they used to call it in the 19th century, there are flesh and blood human beings, that there is a reformist liberal democratic initiative, but that it needs support, that the United States, France, and other actors cannot keep dealing exclusively with the local autocrats, with the various militias, but they also have to take into consideration public opinion in the Arab world. This was supposed to have been the major lesson of the Arab Spring in 2011. They finally realized that the Arab East could not be summarized by oil or something generic like called Islam and Oriental despots, that behind all these cliches, there were men and women, some of them religious, some of them secular, but all of them hoping for a better future with demands focusing on social and economic rights. They were heard for a couple of years, and then the West went back to its previous misguided policies of supporting authoritarianism in order to get short term stability. And I'm afraid we will pay a very heavy price 10 or 20 years down the road if we do not come back to democracy promotion, not in the sense of Western meddling, but in the sense of basically people in the Arab world are not demanding Western intervention. They are just demanding that the West stops propping up and supporting the despots in North Africa, in the Levant, and in the Middle East at large. If the West stops supporting these regimes will fall one after the other. The problem is that they are still being empowered, financed, supported militarily and in various ways by countries that are supposed to be, or that claim to be, the standard bearers of liberalism and democracy.
Thank you, Karim. Thank you for your passionate words, for your work and your insight. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. With that, I wish you all well.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.